For our next session, Tightening the Noose by Land, Sea, and Air, we have brought four great scholars who happen to be four great friends of the National World War II Museum, involved with many of our programs both here and abroad. It will be chaired by a great guy, but also the author of the forthcoming book, 1942, Crux of War. I've been waiting for this book, and I'm still waiting just a little bit because we want John, A, to get it out there, B, for you all to learn from it, and C, to get him to come speak on it at one of our international conferences. John Parshall is the co-author of Shattered Sword, The Untold Story of the Battle of Midway. He is a frequent contributor to publications throughout the country and the world, and as well as digital platforms, podcasts, videos, etc. He is, I'm going to say, the foremost American English-speaking scholar on the Imperial Japanese Navy, and that may cause a fight, but I will stand behind it. John is also integral in our travel programs in that many of you who have been on those tours, you've seen our map books, our guide books. Those maps are all created by John. That's also one of the reasons why I want this book to be finished, so we can get him back on those wonderful maps for our tours. Ladies and gentlemen, for Tightening the Noose, it's my pleasure to turn it over to John Parshall.
Yeah, well done.
Thank you, Jeremy, and I'm not even going to bother to stand up here just to kind of keep the conversational vibe going. The panel that we have here with us today needs no real introduction to any of the, frequent visitors from the museum, but for the sake of our C-SPAN audience, we have with us James Scott, John McManus, and Craig Symonds, who are collectively the authors of 40 books on military history, American military history, and will be respectively covering the air, land, and sea portions of this panel, and I will be chiming in with Japanese Navy, Army, and home front stuff as needed. I think that there's a perception at 80 years remove that when we get to about the middle of 1945, say the May-June timeframe, that the Allies are marching inexorably towards victory over Japan, because at this point, of course, American military supremacy over Japan is both absolute and overwhelming in scale. And yet I would argue that this time period is a period that is full of stress and uncertainty, and that if you look at both the level of the individual soldiers and sailors, you see a lot of uncertainty and angst about what is coming down the pike for them. And also at the level of senior command, there are a lot of very tired and anxious senior commanders as well. And so I want to explore some of those things. But the first thing I want to start out with, actually in my time-honored tradition of never really knowing what I'm going to talk about until I see the panel before me, I want to go into the point system issue once again, because John and I were both chuckling about this as we were watching up here, that the whole point system thing is yet another example of sort of the effete, elitist European theater approach to things. That when Bradley asked the hypothetical question of how would you construct a point system, I think if you were to ask a number of the people in the Pacific, they would answer simply, it ain't over until it's over. Mm-hmm. Get on the boat and get out here, because there was no comparable point system for any of the combatants in the Pacific. And you have a lot of people in organizations like the AmeriCall Division, 32nd Infantry, 41st Infantry, and obviously the Marine Divisions as well, who have been here since 1942, and nobody's passing out little yellow cards to me to ask how many kids I have. So I just wanted to sort of start in on that, and John, do you have any further comments on that? I want to talk about the Navy too.
So I'd add like the 32nd Infantry Division, which of course had fought at the Battle of Luna in 1942, and is a very salty division. By then the 7th Infantry Division, which had fought from Attu onward, the 96th, which is deeply involved in Okinawa. So, the preoccupation, I'd say, especially for ground troops at that point in time, is what's going to happen with the invasion of Japan. Everybody's looking forward to that. They don't know how this is going to turn out, and they're thinking, how will I possibly survive? So points, that might as well be, just in a different universe. I think it was Eugene Sledge, the famous member of the 1st Marine Division, who was talking about how when they heard about the end of the war in Europe, he said something to the effect of, well, that might as well have been happening on the moon almost. Right. They were happy, but it was completely irrelevant to their immediate situation. So when you talk about points in relation to the war against Japan, it's really more obviously of a post-war thing, an occupation thing, a seniority thing as to who's going to be in on the occupation and who's not. It certainly has no bearing in the summer of 1945 when the preoccupation is completely different.
Yeah. Craig, any comments from
Yeah, well, of course, it's different for the Navy, too, because if you can imagine a senior chief who's accumulated the necessary points, which didn't really exist in the Pacific Theater, if you pull all the chiefs off a ship, that ship's not going to function. So the ship is the unit. And so it's where the ship goes and what the ship does and the ship's role rather than individuals within the crew or the officer corps or certainly within the chiefs.
Yeah. So with respect then to the naval combatants that were in the Atlantic, there was no such thing as a point system for them either, right?
No, it doesn't really work for the Navy. I mean, you can't really pull a guy out of a ship and say, all right, you can go home, the rest of you stay here. The whole idea of replacements, and there are replacements, of course, sooner or later. I mean, new boots come into an older command, but it just doesn't function in the same way that it did for the Army.
Yeah. Any comments from the AAF?
No, and this is just actually more of a general comment on that. We were talking about what it was like for VE Day, and there was a pretty famous article by a military correspondent from Okinawa at that time in May of 1945, and he said, he looked at what the troops were doing, and he framed it around this cemetery on Okinawa, and he said, well, everybody's celebrating in Europe, and people are pouring out into Times Square. I'm just watching these white crosses mushroom across this landscape here, and it was indicative, of course, that the war was still going on, and of course there was this tremendous fear as to whether the American morale would keep up. I mean, it was very legitimate. Rich talked about that last night, as to whether or not you could keep the American public on board. And as far as that goes, it's not just the wanting to have your loved ones home and whatnot, but there's also tremendous pent-up consumer demand at this point. The population is really tired. They're going to start building the first consumer cars in 1945. People wanted sewing machines again. They wanted, they really wanted to return to that domestic life that they had had pre-war, and so all of that's kind of baked into that sort of the end of the war there in that time period. The last thing I'll say too is going through Truman's letters at the archive there in Missouri. There's a letter actually when some of the controversy came up in the post-World War II surrounding Hiroshima. He had a letter actually from a GI from the Pacific, and he said, look, all the stuff, the heat you're taking, Truman, don't disregard it, please. He said, I had 3 landings in the Pacific, and I didn't think time was on my side for many more of them. And so I think, those guys who had landed on places like Saipan, they'd fought in Peleliu, of course, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, I mean, they'd seen the hellaciousness of those battles, and they understood what was facing them if this was going to continue on to Kyushu and then on to the Tokyo Plain. So,
yeah, and just for context setting too, when VE Day actually happens, of course, we're stuck in front of the Shuri line on Okinawa, and it's a complete meat grinder for both the Marine and Army divisions that are on that island. I do want to have a follow-up question, though, with respect to the ground forces in particular. How are the senior officers viewing this whole notion of bringing over units from the ETO and then integrating them into the PTO force structure, and what remedial training or any other remedies have to be put in place to take account for the fact that you've lost all your high point guys?
Yeah, I mean, I would say in terms of the senior commanders, it's a mixed sense of anticipation and resentment on some levels too. And what I mean by that is, I think there's a sense among many who are leading formations in the Pacific that the fair-haired guys are in European theater. That they're the ones who have drawn most of the war correspondence, that's been the priority from the beginning, the Germany first policy, and that from a kind of senior officer professional level, some of these guys then are going to kind of redeploy to the Pacific and then get the glory in the Pacific at the end, the way they would have thought of it. Certainly the average soldier isn't thinking that way. They want all the help they can get. But in MacArthur's headquarters, there is certainly some level of trepidation as actually who is going to be reassigned from the European theater. MacArthur does not want necessarily big prominent personalities like Patton or whatever who are going to compete for headlines, of course, obviously. But you know, I mean, you certainly will have that dynamic. But at the same time, too, I think he has thought over quite concisely about who we would like to add to his command. And so officers like Ridgway, for instance, he's going to welcome them with open arms.
Lightning Joe?
Lightning Joe Collins, too, who, of course, had
been
originated in the Pacific as the commander of the 25th Division at Guadalcanal, then eventually becomes the commander of 7th Corps in Europe and might be going back. Courtney Hodges in his first army is supposed to redeploy, and honestly, I don't think that would have been the first choice for many in the Pacific to have Hodges come over. I think I probably would have preferred maybe Sandy Patch, who had also originated in the Pacific and was a pretty successful Army commander by the end of the war. Just as, you know, examples off the top of my head. So you see a sense of welcoming of, yes, we need all the help we can get. We want to add these formations, and boy, we're going to need them for Operation Downfall. And much less maybe the end of if you've still got fighting going on in the Philippines, which you were likely to have, or Okinawa or wherever else. You certainly see that, but also I think that there's a sense too that those who have been in the Pacific from the beginning ought to be the ones still calling the shots from MacArthur on down.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to just ask all three of you, what do you see as the biggest challenges facing the respective services when we get to about the May-June time frame? And I'd like to start with Craig, actually.
Yeah, well, obviously, April 6th of 1945 is the day the Japanese first unleashed the full-scale terror of the kamikaze. The Navy, the Allied navies, and the United States Navy in particular, had pretty much dominated. The surface combatant war is over. The Italians, of course, had given up in 1943. After Leyte Gulf in October of 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy virtually ceases to exist. They've still got the Yamato, and we can talk about that too on another case. The last German capital ship is sunk by the Royal Air Force in November of 1944. So by 1945, there's no surface enemy to take on. What the Navy is doing then is savaging the lines of communication, the supply lines, the transport ships, and particularly the oil tankers of Japan, trying to get their supplies and raw materials from what had been the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia, up to Japan. And by 1945, they're running out of targets. I mean, if you look at the sinkings of Japanese ships, the dominant year is 1944. In 1944, American submarines just in the Pacific sink over 600 Japanese ships. In 1945, only 158. And it's not because they're not trying as hard, it's because they are running out of targets. So the only new problem existing for the United States Navy in this critical period of April-May of 1945 is the emergence of the kamikazes, and that is something they had really not foreseen. Chester Nimitz famously gave a talk to the Naval War College in 1946 after the war, trying to praise the planners at the War College in Newport, saying that everything that came up in this war, we had anticipated, we had gamed out here at the Naval War College. And then he paused and said, except the kamikazes. We didn't see that coming. So the big problem for them is how to deal with this. And it's interesting, Michael Nyberg in the last panel said something about, this Japanese notion that if you can inflict sufficient punishment on the Americans, at some point they'll crack and agree to negotiate. That never happened. But Mike suggests that's not completely an insane notion. But there is a cultural differentiation between the two sides. They really just don't completely understand one another. And I think that's part of the problem too. How long will this have to go on with kamikazes sinking our ships at the rate they were sunk off of Okinawa? How long can we sustain this? How long can we survive this? I think that's a concern.
Yeah, I mean, the challenges are absolutely immense for the ground forces. And I mean, if you think about it in terms of the point Craig just made and Mike made earlier about the reasonable nature of the Japanese position on whether or not the Americans will crack and agree to something short of unconditional surrender, agree to some sort of settlement that perhaps save some semblance of the empire, some semblance of the Japanese occupation in China. I mean, there's a lot of ways this could have gone. And so this is what you're fighting for in 1945 as the average GI, whether we are going to see it through. And this was no sure thing. I mean, the level of violence and ferocity of the operations in 1945 is absolutely indescribable. It's unfathomable. And if you think about the European theater too, our casualty rates in the US Army in April 1945 are almost as high as they had been in the Battle of Normandy the previous summer. So we've got that. And so finally that nightmare is over. But if we're thinking what's going on in the Pacific Asia theater at this point in time, well, yes, the Battle of Okinawa has just ramped up. We've just gotten rid of the nightmare of Iwo Jima. And oh, by the way, there is the largest campaign of them all raging in the Philippines. And that is absolutely not coming anywhere near to an end. Sixth Army is enmeshed on Luzon from January 9th all the way to September 2nd, 1945, dealing with an attritional kind of battle. Eighth Army under Robert Eichelberger is carrying out dozens of amphibious operations that spring and summer of 1945. And so from that perspective, we are worried about what's in front of us with the next battle, with the next tactical struggle against these guys who are basically fighting to the death. Yeah. But we are waging that attritional struggle too, so that by the summer of 45, if you're a Japanese soldier in the Philippines, the greater threat to your life at that point is starvation and disease versus American firepower. And believe me, American firepower is immense. Yeah. So the question then is the challenge in front of us, oh, by the way, on the horizon is Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan, which is going to be very ground soldier-centric, of course. And so we're already running out of infantry. We're already running out of trained combat manpower in other MOSs. Can we bring in new replacements and sustain? Can we redeploy from Europe? How will that work administratively? How will it work morale-wise? I mean, these are really difficult issues to kind of sort through. So I would say there's really no sense of triumphalism as we get to midsummer 1945. There's a sense of palpable dread about what everybody expects, which of course is the invasion of Japan.
Yeah, and I'll say, the air is actually much slower to kind of come online in the Pacific Theater for the air war against the Japanese Empire and the homeland there. And, and that's all because we just don't have the bases until the summer of 1944. And for those who want to learn more about that, I would suggest you come with my good buddy John and I on the Pacific tour where we go to Guam, Saipan, and Tinian, and we discuss these battles and why these battles were so pivotal for the air war. And what it was is we basically needed to have bases within range of Japan's key industrial cities, places like Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe. And we didn't have those until we captured the Mariana Islands. The Mariana Islands are about 1,500 miles south of Tokyo, and so even that's a tremendous distance, but we were able to bridge that distance because of the creation of the B-29 bomber, which was, of course, the largest and single most expensive weapon system of World War II, actually costing more than the atomic bomb, but it was a hemispheric bomber that was capable of bridging that great distance. And so we don't actually introduce the B-29 into theater until the fall of 1944 as a strategic bomber. And of course, at that point, we are bringing the tactics over from the air war in Europe, which is going to be daylight, high altitude precision bombing. The idea being that we're going to first go in and we're going to knock out Japan's capabilities to rearm through planes and things of that nature, going after engine factories, fuselage, things of that nature. And of course, we run into all sorts of challenges in the fall of 1944, namely the fact that Japan's weather is really, really difficult, and that it's an island nation. It has frequently it's cloudy, it rains. I mean, there's some months we get literally as few as 3 to 6 clear days to bomb there, which if you're trying to do high altitude daylight bombing, you need to be able to see what your target is. On top of this, we discovered the jet streams, which we had no idea existed at that point, which would literally, they were so powerful that it would literally freeze bombers over their target, which would make them susceptible to anti-aircraft fire. And so we really tried to kind of work around that throughout the fall of 1944 with Brigadier General Haywood Hansel, but he wasn't making any real headway. In fact, by the end of that year, he'd not been able to knock out a single Japanese factory or war plant, and it leads to Hap Arnold's firing of him and replacing him with Kurt LeMay. And of course, Kurt LeMay was everything Haywood Hansel was not, but he ultimately embraced Hansel's philosophy and strategy for bombing until it didn't work. He spent about 6 weeks trying to tinker with high-altitude daylight bombing, tried to bring them down a little bit under the jet streams, worked on maintenance, things of that nature, pilot training, navigation, all that, but ultimately realized it simply wouldn't work. And so it's in March of 1945 when he makes a dramatic shift in American strategy, and that's going to go from precision bombing to low-altitude fire raids on Japanese cities. And that's going to be a game changer. Of course, that first raid is going to take place a little after midnight on March 10th, 1945. He's going to send almost 300 bombers over Tokyo, and they're going to create one of the largest firestorms of World War II. It's going to lead to about 105,000 civilian deaths. 16 square miles of Japan are going to be obliterated by 6 a.m. Literally 1 out of every 4 buildings in Tokyo vanishes. And so that then, LeMay realizes that this is a game changer. He immediately begins launching a very aggressive campaign after that. And within the span of less than 10 days, he actually burns out 32 square miles of several of Japan's key cities, Nagoya, Osaka, and of course Tokyo. He's going to accelerate that up until he literally runs out of incendiaries. He's got to wait on a resupply of those. Then he's going to kick back in again. But by June, he's going to have destroyed 102 square miles of Japan's key cities. And at that point, most of Japan's industry is centered around a half dozen cities, and at that point, they're pretty much all burned out. So the Air Force is really, by the spring and summer, really ramping up into the fire-burning campaign, and really, LeMay has essentially kind of hit his stride at that point.
Which begs
James, I don't want to poach on your territory, but I just want to add to that to read the justification for why this shift in March of 1945 takes place is really fascinating, because the idea is, well, we're going to knock out Japanese industry. The argument between the Americans and the British all along had been the Americans said, we can hit that factory, we can make them stop producing ball bearings or whatever it is they're doing because we have the Norden bomb sight and we're going to have the B-29. But when LeMay figures out this is not working, he says, well, it's almost as good to take out what he calls the housing units of the workers.
Yeah.
And so the justification is, we'll shut down the factories by burning down the homes of the people who work in the factories, and therefore we're really striking at Japanese industry, when in fact, of course, it was terror bombing.
Well, and I'll tell you, and Tokyo was a unique one in that literally about 50% of manufacturing in Tokyo did take place in home industries. And so Japan did have sort of a system where they sort of outsourced the manufacturing of parts and things like that to home factories and whatnot. And so Tokyo, more than any other city, had that sort of dominant.
Right? Okay.
And that was what LeMay pushed for. Later on in that campaign, there was some of the cities that he burned had virtually no industrial capacity whatsoever. So, but at that point, he'd really hit,
we're well into dehousing at that point.
Yeah, exactly.
A la Bomber Harris.
And add, too, another point in the sense of like the weapon itself. Of course, the incendiary raids are the biggest example of the use of fire at this point. Yeah. But this is happening across the board, really, in the entire American war effort now against Japan, the use of fire against them. We're seeing that more and more. Napalm that had come into play, not just in the Pacific, but also in Europe too, but especially now in this last year or so of the war.
Was the first use of napalm on the battlefield.
Right, exactly, and on the battlefield too. Of course, we've got the flamethrower teams, with the tanks you'd put on your back, and boy, was that a popular job. I'm signing up for that one. And then as of about Iwo Jima onward, we've got the flame tanks, and in Okinawa especially, those are a major weapon the 10th Army has. So in addition to also the cave-to-cave fighting, in which engineers are a lot of times just pouring in gasoline and burning the Japanese out. So it's kind of interesting to think of it as, here is history's most modern war at that point, but now the Americans are using humanity's, one of its oldest, most elemental weapens to bring about to the end. Fire.
And that's really a reaction. I'm going to pipe in as the token Japanese guy here. A lot of post-war observers, I don't think, understand the fact that the Japanese were actively adapting their tactics throughout this time period as well. And you see a transition after the Marianas campaign where the initial defense plan had been to actually, kick the Americans back into the ocean. They realize that they can't do that. And so there's a transition, and you see the first manifestations of this new strategy at places like Peleliu and Biak, Peleliu famously, where the whole game plan is buying time. And so we know that the garrison is going to be wiped out, but can we extract the maximum amount of casualties and time from the Americans to give the home islands the time they need to prepare and arm the new legions that will be defending the Japanese home islands? And so what you see then in places like Okinawa and Iwo Jima is a movement towards this very static mode of warfare on the part of the Japanese, where we do have to burn them out, and the most efficient way to do that is with fire in a lot of cases.
Yeah, you saw after the Battle of Manila, the flamethrower was a very popular weapon because the Battle of Manila is the first big urban fight, really the only big urban fight in the Pacific War. And troops are going, building by building, literally room by room, and so they realized that, for these troops too, who had spent so much of the time fighting in jungles, fighting in beaches, that suddenly you're in an urban environment, that the flamethrower was a very valuable weapon. And, but it would suck up all the oxygen in a room, and so you had to be careful that the operator didn't pass out.
Absolutely, they
yeah.
constantly have to be mindful of that. And also, too, they are sometimes on a higher point of the building pouring gasoline on lower level rooms to basically flame them out that way, and they have to be careful not to burn themselves out as they're doing this. The flamethrower teams are really the front and center weapon that's happening in the hardcore of Manila, as you know so well. I mean, it's like that's the lead weapon for your squad.
And there was a spike I remember reading, and it may have been in your book, about folks signing up for being flamethrower operators after that battle.
Yeah.
Like it's,
Popular job.
Yeah.
All right, I want to take it up to the command level here. I was just having a conversation a few days ago with our mutual friend Trent Hone, very good naval historian, and I was reading his book on Nimitz and also your book on Nimitz, Craig, and the impression that I get out of the final 6 months of the war is that Chester Nimitz, who was the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet and also the theater commander for the majority of the Pacific Ocean, is now engaged in a two-front war, with one front being against the Japanese and the other front being against Douglas MacArthur. Because as we get closer to Japan, this whole notion of having two theater commanders in this geographic area is becoming more and more fictional, I guess. And so any comments on that, General?
Well, you know, Nimitz and MacArthur stand as kind of metaphor for the argument between the Army and the Navy more broadly. And this really goes to the whole question that the last panel discussed in some depth, and that we will too, I assume, and that is whether we can end this war by simply blockading Japan, bombing it from the air, and just letting it starve to death until it can no longer survive, or invade. Now, the argument against invading is, well, Americans have to put their boots on the ground and get killed. But how many Japanese, given the culture that surrender is unthinkable, how many Japanese would have to die before Japan's leaders said, well, okay, that's enough, we quit? And it leads to the whole question, and we can get into this later on, I suppose, about what is the greater morality, to drop that atomic bomb or not to drop that atomic bomb. But Chester Nimitz was very much on the side of, let's blockade our submarines. Nimitz was an old submarine hand. Our submarines have cut off Japan. They are not getting anything. Some of those factories that were bombed from the air had ceased to function months before because they couldn't get the raw materials to make anything anyway. So with the bombing from the air, with the submarine blockade, kind of an untraditional blockade, not a blockade the way you think of Nelson and the Napoleonic Wars blockading the coast, but submarines making it literally impossible to bring any supplies in. So Nimitz was very much in favor of blockade and bombing. MacArthur wants to invade.
And mines as
MacArthur
well.
wants to invade because the Army thinks this is going to be the great ultimate achievement of American arms in the Second World War. And they get into a little bit of a brouhaha, too, about who's going to be in charge of that invasion. Protocol in every amphibious landing in the Second World War was that the Navy commander, the senior Navy commander on the scene, had command authority until the Army officer established his headquarters on the beach. Then he had command authority. And even in a case, for example, at D-Day, when a Higgins boat was going ashore and there was I think it was a 2 or 3 star sitting in there, come on, ensign, get this boat ashore. Go land over there. And he said, General, I'm in charge of this boat until we get ashore. Sit down. And he said, yes, ensign. But MacArthur would not stand for that. MacArthur said, no, I will be in charge. I will be in charge of the naval operations. I will be in charge of air operations. I will be in charge of the landings. I will be in charge of everything. And the Joint Chiefs went with him. And Nimitz thought this was a recipe for disaster. He just absolutely did not believe, not only that the invasion was necessary, but the particular protocols established for that invasion were a recipe for disaster. So there was a lot going on between the two. But let me say this about Nimitz, and that is his great strength, which was also the great strength of Eisenhower, let me say, is his ability to pour oil on troubled water, to be calm, to keep people together. We're all on the same team. Let's get this done most efficient way we can. Eisenhower, on several occasions, brought not only people like Montgomery and Patton onto the same team, but even Charles de Gaulle, for God's sake. And that's a measure of his diplomatic skill, and Nimitz had many of those same skills.
Yeah, and there's a lot of layers to MacArthur's thinking at this point in time. There's 1.8 million Army ground soldiers in theater in 1945. Not all of them under MacArthur's control, but there will be once we get to the invasion of Japan. He is definitely thinking in terms of a monumental invasion. He has had this tendency throughout much of the war to be sort of looking to the next operation, even as his current operation is still going on, and to try and say the current operation is somehow done, that it's mopping up time or whatever. We had seen this a lot in the Philippines. So by the summer of 1945, MacArthur is very much looking ahead to how he's going to control this major invasion. And how he's going to work this out with Nimitz. You've had this kind of uneasy coexistence of these two major theater commanders who have at times cooperated, at times not. And when they have cooperated, it's mainly because of Nimitz's forbearance, more so than MacArthur giving to him, I think. But you're going to have to figure out what is the division of labor and division of duties and who controls what. And MacArthur, after the war, really quite criticized the idea of the divided command that we have in the Pacific and whatever else. The implication, of course, is always that it should have been under his command, and there's even a kind of a political power block in the country kind of agitating toward that for years. The Hearst newspaper empire and media empire very much pushing that, and they're very anti-Marine in their coverage and trying to make this whole situation look bad so that MacArthur can take over. So Nimitz has to, he's up against that, and they also, too, have to kind of parse out exactly how we're going to approach this invasion. So I've always thought each of the services is kind of approaching this endpoint through their own lens, quite understandably. Blockade and mining on the Navy side, firebombing, strategic bombing on the aerial side, and, of course, a land invasion, for the Army. But I will say this. Yes, MacArthur's fixated on that, and certainly he is no stranger to wanting glory and all that kind of stuff. But once he sees that there are other options, by the late summer 1945, he's only too happy to give up the idea of the invasion. To his credit, he does not tenaciously dig in and say, no, we're going to invade no matter what, even though we've had the atomic bombs and whatever. Maybe there's another option. He's happy to see another way.
There's an incident where he sends his right-hand man, Sutherland, to talk to Nimitz about, I believe, turning over the Army troops that are currently under Nimitz's command on Okinawa over to... Yeah. That meeting does not go real well.
At all.
Anybody want to talk about that?
No. You want to delve into that, or you want me to?
Well, let me start, then you can finish up. I mean, for those not aware, and everybody in this audience certainly is, but there may be some watching who are not, the command authority in the Pacific was divided into two. MacArthur thought he should have it all, and an argument can be made that he should. He's the most senior, the most experienced, the most decorated uniformed officer in the United States. And it annoys him that he's given what's called the Southwest Pacific area. Now that includes most of the big land masses, obviously the continent of Australia, New Guinea, and the Philippines critically. That's his command area. But Nimitz gets all the rest. And it's 65 million square miles. It's the largest command theater in the Second World War. So in a way, you can almost imagine MacArthur looking, why does this guy was a commander when I was a general, for crying out loud, and now we're co-equals? This cannot be right. So when the invasion of Japan is looming, the idea is, well, we need to bring these together. We need to dissolve that barrier line. And MacArthur's proposal is, I will now command all of the soldiers, not only those in my theater, but those in your theater of operation who have worked under and for Nimitz since the beginning of the war, and you can have the 7th Fleet, which has been operating with me in the Southwest Pacific, but they're Navy guys, so you can have them back. So his notion was, let's return to I'm in command of all the Army guys, you're in command of all the Navy guys, and we'll work something out.
Yeah, so he sends his chief of staff, Dick Sutherland, to try and work out some of these details. Now, a little background on Sutherland. Okay, so Sutherland is an interesting guy in that he's sort of, he originally joins the Army as a private, and eventually gets a commission. And Just way of backstory, he becomes MacArthur's chief of staff sort of on the eve of World War II. And he will later kind of brag about how he pushed Dwight Eisenhower out of the whole staff under MacArthur. And Sutherland was a guy who just was almost uniformly hated in theater. He just had this ability to portray arrogance, condescension, lack of tolerance. He was a very unpleasant individual to deal with. But he was also, to his credit, a pretty effective chief of staff at times. And MacArthur was very, gentlemanly in his dealings with people one-on-one usually. And so, he kind of, like Eisenhower in Europe, who was much the same way, he kind of needed a chief of staff who was a little more hard-headed, a little bit more waspish and a little bit more nettling and difficult to deal with. But the problem for Sutherland is he was also incredibly arrogant. So when you work with someone as arrogant as MacArthur and you can compete with him on that scale, you're doing well. So he goes over and tries to work with Nimitz's staff, and I mean, he just is so off-putting in these details. They can't stand him. They want him out. Nimitz is put off by him, isn't he?
Well, this is the thing, Nimitz is such a gentleman on almost every occasion, and on this occasion, he just says, no, I'm not going to do that.
Yeah.
And in fact, he says it so emphatically that Nimitz's own staff was kind of shocked. They fell back in their chair. Who is this guy?
Sutherland could bring that out in people.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, he just had that. So the ranking Army officer under Nimitz for most of the war was Lieutenant General Robert Richardson. He had a very frustrating job as he saw it, that he had no real command control over a lot of the Army units that were in, invasions under Nimitz's auspices, like Saipan or whatever else. But he had the training and administrative and logistical duties. And so you're trying to meld Richardson's forces back now with MacArthur's and somehow coexist with the Navy and work out these divisions of responsibility. So one night Richardson has dinner with Sutherland, and Richardson kept this incredibly detailed, fascinating diary, very sort of insightful on people. And he talked about Sutherland, and and you could just imagine sitting at this dinner because he talked about how Sutherland was, quote, the most conceited person I've ever known, and how in the dinner, Sutherland just dominated the conversation and just constantly talking about himself and gabbing on, and Richardson just sort of sunk in his chair and was like trying to coexist and get through this thing. This is the kind of person who's trying to work out these details with these others where you need some diplomacy. This was not Sutherland's strength. His strength was efficiency, competence, very single-minded goal, loyalty to MacArthur until he wasn't, when he tries to usurp him in 1944 a little bit, and that had gone by the board. So Sutherland was actually on the way out by the end of World War II. And eventually MacArthur will have a different chief of staff after the war. But in the interim, it's Sutherland trying to work out some of the details, but he is not quite successful. So MacArthur is going to have to take the lead on that, and also Dick Marshall, who's the deputy chief of staff under Sutherland and has a much more pleasing personality. So what I think is interesting about this, and maybe the takeaway, is that these are great weighty issues, but in a way they just come down to personalities too, on a very individualistic scale.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to do a follow-up with respect to the Army Air Forces. Okay, so here we are in May, June of '45. You've successfully burned out most of the major urban areas. What's your plan, Curtis? If this war goes on into November or, God forbid, February, March of '46, what are you going to be doing for me?
Well, even to back up just a little bit, because you're dealing in the Pacific with these two dominant, well, really one very dominant personality and one really great diplomat. And of course, the air side of that, you have General Hap Arnold. And of course, Hap Arnold is, for folks who may not be all that familiar with him, he's got this grandfatherly head of white hair, and he's got this big smile. And Hap was short for happy, but I mean, he would have fired his own mother. One of his aides said, if she got in the way of success. And so Hap is having to navigate the air war in a theater dominated by the Navy and the Army. And you got to remember, at this point, the Air Force is still part of the Army. So it's sort of like the stepchild here that's trying to get attention. And so Arnold realized when he was bringing the B-29 online and going to send it out to the Pacific that he had to be very careful in how he was going to introduce it, because he knew MacArthur would immediately seize it and not use it as a strategic weapon, but as a tactical bomber. It would be there to help with invasions and things like that. And he also suspected the Navy would use it. In fact, the Navy did use it, for example, when they were preparing for Okinawa to go in and blow up airfields and runways and things like that. And Arnold really saw the B-29 as a way to end the war and to really make the case for strategic air power. And more importantly for him, part of his big crusade that goes all the way back to his work with Billy Mitchell, from whom he was a sort of a mentee of, to bring about an independent air service. And B-29 was his key to that. And in the Pacific War was where he really needed to shine. He needed to own a share of victory alongside the Navy and, of course, the Army. And so when he's coming in, he's figuring out, all right, how are we going to do this? He realizes that he can't just toss the B-29 in there because it's going to get gobbled up. And so he comes up with this very unorthodox idea to create what's called the 20th Air Force. And the 20th Air Force is going to be a standalone Air Force. He is actually going to be the commander of it in Washington. He is going to report directly to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and then he's going to send his liaison, his commander, out there basically to run it. But the idea is that by doing this, he then kind of creates an equal branch of service out there to compete with these other with the Army and the Navy. And of course, that's LeMay's job. And LeMay is effectively out there running his own independent air service at that time, his own Air Force at this point. And of course, as the sort of the territorial struggles are playing out there, Arnold's just hoping to run out the clock and that they can burn down as many cities and that they can bring Japan to its knees before you ever have to have that invasion that's going to be very, very bloody. And so he goes out in June to meet with Curtis LeMay and to kind of get a rundown on how things are going. And he asks LeMay, he says, when is this war going to be over? And LeMay says, give me 30 minutes. And he sends his guys back, and he comes back at this point. And he says, all right, by October 1st, I will have run out of cities.
Right.
And by that, he will have burned down every major city in Japan. He's like, at that point, we're done. What else are we going to do? And so, but Arnold, of course, can't really, so he's, as you're talking about blockading, as you're talking about invading, of course, the Air Service is thinking at this point, it's all about burning cities and trying to bring the Japanese to their knees through that way. So that's kind of how that's playing out, is sort of in the shadow of this more titanic struggle between the Army and Navy is the Air Service.
Can you talk a little bit, though, about Operation Starvation?
Yeah.
And how that
and
fits into LeMay's view of things?
Exactly. And LeMay was very much and I find him to be one of the most fascinating characters in the Pacific War because he gets really caricatured in the post-war era, particularly during Vietnam. He bombs away LeMay. He's the guy who, if a hammer's your only tool, every problem's a nail. But he was really a pretty visionary commander, and he really demonstrated that during the European theater when he helped design the formations that helped B-17s get through. And of course, he reorganizes the air war in the Pacific to great success. And so, LeMay comes in and he's, sorry, remind me when you...
Starvation.
Gotcha.
Mining.
So LeMay comes in, and of course, he views strategic bombing as exactly that. That's what he's there to do. And of course, the Navy comes over and says, we want you to participate in the mining campaign.
Yes.
And he's like, do I have to? I really don't want to. Well, he ultimately assigns an air wing over on Tinian to kind of run that, and it's highly successful. Yeah. So they're parachuting these mines, and it dovetails with the submarine blockade of the Japanese homeland. And as Craig had noted earlier, Japan is a materially bankrupt nation. It's 85% mountainous. They're literally self-sufficient in 2 or 3 industries like fish oil and sulfur. Everything else comes in by ship, and of course, at this point, the life in the homeland is deteriorating. They're run out of fuel. They're parking their battleships for anti-aircraft duty. Cars are putting around on charcoal. People don't have enough food and all of that. And so we're going to then add to this the aerial mining campaign. And of course, LeMay was very much against it, but he goes along with it because part of Hap Arnold's deal with the Joint Chiefs of Staff is that when needed, the B-29s will be pulled in to cooperate with the other services. Well, Operation Starvation, they drop over 12,000 mines in Japanese waters, and it turns out to be highly successful. They're averaging about 5 Japanese ships sunk a day until the end of the war. In fact, it really turns out to be one of the more successful components of the B-29 campaign, so much so that even LeMay, who hated to give credit to anybody else, particularly the Navy, it admits at the end of the war that, that actually turned out pretty good. So,
Well, and this feeds into the larger topic of, at face value, you would think to yourselves, well, if the Japanese are thinking that they're going to have to prepare for an invasion of the home islands, why don't they just bring in the troops that are already in China and Manchuria in the form of the Kwantung Army, and they can't get them there.
They got some, yeah.
They got some, but by and large, they are going to have to make this a domestic operation, raise new troops, and then figure out how to arm them. Which is one of the reasons that the targeting of the war industries continues as aggressively as it does. I want to segue back to the Navy for a little bit. Craig, you talked about the fact that the emergence of the kamikaze threat was something that was unanticipated by the Navy, and it turns into, if you look at the casualty figures for Okinawa, the U.S. Navy loses over 5,000 sailors killed in the course of that campaign, primarily by kamikazes. Fast forward to what is the Navy's viewpoint and preparations for a potential invasion, and how are they going to be facing up to the kamikaze threat that is likely to be manifesting itself off of the Japanese, which is going to be aimed primarily at the invasion transports, is it not?
Yes.
Probably, yes, almost certainly. That they're worried about it. I mean, it's a genuine concern. I mean, off Okinawa, the kamikaze sank, I think 36 ships, damaged 300 more. It got so bad there were actual conversations about, can we continue with this invasion? Now, they did continue, and Okinawa was taken. But extrapolate that forward to, if this is what they will do, 1,500 kamikazes to defend Okinawa, how many to defend Kyushu? The pilots are increasingly young and increasingly inexperienced. The planes are not necessarily frontline planes anymore. But nevertheless, some are going to get through. And the Navy's very worried about it. There really isn't an answer, and I think that's what was so concerning.
Right.
And it gets back to the broader question of how much punishment, how much pain, how much sacrifice, how many losses can we take before we have to begin to reconsider the practicability of an invasion at all. And that's one of the things in the back of Nimitz's mind when he argues, and King too, Ernest King, his boss, in their minds about whether we want to go ahead with this invasion, whether it makes sense to do that.
Yeah, and the Japanese approach for what would have been Operation Downfall for their kamikazes would have been, in my view, much smarter than what they had at Okinawa, where they're trying for capital ships, they're trying for carriers and whatnot. That's great, but what's really going to stop the invasion is to hit the troop ships, to hit the oilers, to hit all the logistical sinews of what makes this invasion happen. You really hadn't seen a lot of that from the kamikazes, but that was going to be the plan at Kyushu. And I think that's horrifying, not just from a Navy point of view, but from an Army point of view.
Absolutely.
Because if you've got a troop ship that is nailed by a kamikaze or two, I mean, imagine how many soldiers you're going to lose packed aboard ships.
Well,
It's important to remember, too, I'll just add that they had over 10,000 kamikazes that they were preparing on Kyushu. So, I mean, it was going to be a massive, massive slaughter.
And from an air defense standpoint, it's one thing for the Navy to be parking picket destroyers off of Okinawa and picking up an enemy that is flying over hundreds of miles of open water before they even, so we have that much engagement distance in terms of fighter protection. It's quite another to have an invasion fleet that is parked a couple miles offshore. Right. There could be a kamikaze base, which is actually nothing more than a plane in a cave with a runway. And that dude has only got to fly, a dozen miles, most of it over land where we don't have radar interdiction, and then here are the beaches, and there's my transport.
Well, 10 to 20% of them are probably going to get through. Right. Much less suicide boats, too. Yeah. That's another weapon they've got in the offing that could have been probably worse than before.
Which brings me to my surprise question.
Oh, boy.
Okay, so one of the things that Rich Frank actually talks about in Downfall is that it's pretty clear that there was an impending come-to-Jesus meeting shaping up between the Army and the Navy over the wisdom of carrying out this invasion, because the intelligence reports that are coming in terms of the Japanese troop concentrations and buildup in Kyushu are alarming by the time we get to the middle of July. In the conversation that I had with Trent Hone, he posited that you really, if you're a senior military man in America, you cannot put the president on the spot of making that decision. That the Joint Chiefs would have needed to have come to FDR and said, this is our considered opinion. So envision for me, if you will, a meeting between Marshall, King, Arnold, and of course Leahy, who in many ways, as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and also as FDR's spirit animal in a lot of ways, would have ended up having to be sort of the peacekeeper. What's the over-under? Who wins that battle?
Well, there was such a meeting,
Okay.
May 18th, they get together, and Harry Truman has Leahy is there, and I've forgotten who else is in the room. Marshall, of course, is making the argument for an invasion. It's necessary. We've got to do it. And he had a timetable, Coronet, and all. we're going to go Kyushu, and then we're going to go Honshu, and he had it all worked out to mid-fall of 1946. And what Truman says, I mean, in a single sentence, is I have to decide whether to invade or blockade and bomb. I mean, that's almost a literal quotation. And so his concern is casualties. Right. And he asks Marshall. Marshall says, well, it'll work out because we figured out it'll be about the same number of casualties as you got on Luzon, 31,000. That's actually a little low. It was about 36,000. But Leahy challenges this. And he said, no, wait a minute. Allied losses, American losses on Okinawa were 35%. We're going to put 766,000 men ashore on Kyushu. 35% of that is over 200,000. That almost doubles the number of casualties in the European theater. I mean, horrifying, horrendous. But Marshall argues, no, it won't be like that at all because, you see, in Kyushu, instead of going into the caves and trying to fight through the Shuri line and so forth, it's going to be a battle of maneuver where we will have all of the advantages. And at the end of the meeting, Truman goes around the room and asks him to vote. King is there, and he votes, yeah, Kyushu, let's invade. And I think King was saying, let's see how Kyushu goes before we do Honshu. But he got a unanimous vote out of his Joint Chiefs.
And to which my reply is, that was May.
Yeah. It's actually June. It
I
takes
thought it was
place in
June,
June.
but-
It's
Yeah,
June 18th.
no,
Now we're in
there's-
late July, and I
Yeah.
know now that the Japanese have 900,000 service personnel on Kyushu. That changes everything. And also, I just wanted to point out, as the guy who goes to Japan on these tours, having taken the buses through the mountain passes in Kagoshima, man, there was not going to be any battle of maneuver in southern Kyushu. I mean, it's very, very hilly terrain. Anyway, pray continue.
No, I mean, I was going to say, too, I mean, it's at that point, you've got Truman says, I don't want another Okinawa from one end of the island to the next.
You're
And
gonna
so,
get
no, they very much are. But if you look, at the very end of those meeting minutes, it says very cryptically, and then we discussed some other matters.
Yeah.
And of course, that has always been like the likely reference to the atomic bomb. Right. And of course, over this entire discussion is the fact that we're heading toward the test in New Mexico to know whether or not we're going to have a city-destroying weapon that could be an ace in the holster. I mean, you can't, though, you have to keep pushing the invasion plans forward because, if the bomb doesn't work or something else happens. Sure. But I think they do have in the back of their mind the idea that this is potentially going to be coming online. We are going to have the ability to use this. And because if the atomic bomb is really, it's a political weapon. I mean, they've already demonstrated through firebombing that you can burn an entire city. In fact, I mean, in Tokyo, you do far more physical destruction in one night in Tokyo than you do in either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. And the Japanese still didn't surrender. So you needed something to sort of shake up the body politic in Japan, and that's where they were really leaning on the atomic bomb. But they had to keep the invasion stuff moving forward. Now, you do see that by the time they get up to Potsdam, and while they're there, the decryption, and Rich has done it masterfully in his book Downfall, really shows that all of the early estimates that they were using to frame the discussion in May and June are really kind of out the window at this point, and that Japan is actually building up a force where it's going to be over 900,000 troops on Kyushu, and they're going to be really coming in facing almost instead of 3-to-1, a 1-to-1
on the beaches.
Yeah, and it's not a recipe for victory, as one of MacArthur's aides actually wrote at that point. So.
And it's kind of a fateful meeting that sticks with us today in the sense of the casualty estimate. The low ball of 50,000, the high of 1 million fatalities, everything in between that you constantly hear in popular culture. There would have been 1 million casualties. There would have been 500,000. My opinion is that those estimates are kind of pointless. We all know it would have been horrible.
Yeah.
And if we're thinking about Operation Olympic, the invasion of Kyushu, okay, so that's going to go to 6th Army, Lieutenant General Walter Kruger's 6th Army. He would have 14 divisions for that invasion, and he'd still be outnumbered. Now, obviously, qualitatively, soldier to soldier, the Americans would have an advantage. But does that matter when you're facing an enemy that is willing to fight to the death, that has these kamikazes, that has the difficult terrain that you've talked about? I mean, all of the above. I don't know that it really matters whether we estimate it's 100K or 500K or whatever. We all know it's going to be horrible. So we're looking for other options, and that's what makes sense, I think, and it is the most important thing to come out of this meeting, at least in my view.
And one thing I'll add too is, as Rich talked about last night, at this point, you've got the entire citizenry is being taught to fight with spears and everything else. Do you really want a generation of American Marine and soldier who's going to go in there and shoot children and
would-
shoot
would
teenagers and shoot grandmothers. I mean, what is that going to do to that returning GI back to the States who's had that experience?
If he does return.
If he does return, and the
What will you
trauma
back?
of that,
Yeah,
exactly.
Yep.
Yeah, my opinion is that at this point, King is pretty clearly positioning to pull the rug out of from under that whole notion. That,
Well, he's talking about alternate invasion sites at that point.
Yeah.
That the buildup is so extreme. And I think they had a meeting scheduled for August 6th to talk about that. And that's, of course, the day of the bombing of Hiroshima. And I don't think that meeting ever takes place, but they recognized where it was headed.
I think at this point, I would like to turn it over to questions. But before I do that, I missed my opportunity to blurb the books, the most recent books of my 3 panel members.
You did miss that.
I did.
Come on.
do that.
I mean, seriously. You had one job.
I know. You were very important.
God.
And so, with that in mind, thank you, friends.
Anything we can do, buddy.
I would just like James Scott, his book Black Snow is the definitive account of the firebombing of Tokyo. John McManus, of course, has just wrapped up a 3-volume trilogy on the U.S. Army in the Pacific with its most recent volume, To the Ends of the Earth. And finally, Craig Symonds has just come out with a brand new history of the Annapolis class of 1940, which someone on this end of the table blurbs on the back of that. It looks at the casualties and the stories of that class, which is the most highly decorated and takes the highest casualties of any of our classes from any of our military academies. Annapolis goes to war. And so with that, I would like to turn it over to Jeremy.
Well, round of applause for our round table, please. And in the spirit of blurbing, again, 1942, crux of war. We're all eagerly anticipating it, John. If you have questions, please raise your hands, and Connie and I will come to you. I think we're going to start in the very front row, gentlemen, with Mr. Hayes.
All through the books that I've read on the end of the war here, there's MacArthur is fudging and also Marshall because they don't include the Navy, and then there's additions for the Navy. But it seemed to me that at Okinawa, where you could say 1 soldier dead to 4 wounded. In the Navy, the ratios weren't that way. And with the kamikaze, it seemed to me that there would be the deaths in the Navy 2 miles away, and with kamikazes and those would be incredibly great. And so I was wondering what the ratio of dead to wounded in the Navy only at Okinawa was, and maybe at because it seemed to me there would be the ratios that were used could not be sustained the same ratios for the Army or the Marines.
It's actually 1 for 1. It's about 5,000 killed and 5,000 wounded.
Right. And the 5,000 Navy killed is actually 4,997 or something like that, but around 5,000 killed, more than either the Army or the Marine Corps. That's the only time that happened, and the kamikazes are the reason. And that's a higher proportion of KIA to wounded than you often see or ever see, really. And that's because if you face the kamikazes, survival is problematic. You want to?
Yeah, I mean, that's right. It's kamikaze hits, you're going to have a very high fatality rate versus wound rate. In infantry or ground combat, for the Americans at least, it's generally 1 killed for every 3 or 4 wounded, maybe even 5 wounded, whatever it would be. Combat fatigue adds to some of the equation there too. You have about 12,000 American fatalities at Okinawa. So just think, I think the Navy numbers were 4,907, something like that. So right there, that's well over a third. And that I honestly think that's why would it be any different at Kyushu or at Honshu than it is at Okinawa at that point? And of course, let's add too, You have 503 naval fatalities, too, in the invasion of Luzon, leading up to January 9th, 1945. They don't sink any ships that time because they just don't have enough planes to send out to continue the intensity. But this is a fearsome weapon, and I've often said this to this day. I don't know that there's ever been any real kind of tactic or whatever fail-safe kind of approach to dealing with a suicide bomber. Because it really still applies into the 21st century, as we painfully know. In World War II, they're in planes. In the 21st century, it's on foot or in vehicles or whatever it be. It's the same kind of concept. So I think it's reasonable to suppose that the naval casualties are going to be absolutely staggering, in terms of the human costs.
The next question is going to be all the way to your left towards the front with Connie, please.
Good morning, and thanks for that great volley. That was wonderful. Mr. Symonds, I'm going to direct this to you. Can you just talk a little bit about how the development and implementation of the UDT maybe helped in decreasing some of the casualties that we had invading the many beaches that were invaded?
I'm sorry, treating the casualties?
No. What was the impact of the development and implementation of UDT and their intelligence gathering and clearing of underwater obstacles in helping the landings and maybe decreasing casualties?
Yeah, the UDT teams were important really in 44 as well as in 45. I mean, obviously they played an important role at D-Day, which this museum demonstrates quite clearly. But the sophistication of improved weapons in the Second World War led to the development, the more sophisticated development of underwater demolition removal teams, which subsequently become, of course, the SEALs, Navy SEALs. I'm not sure I'm responding to your question. I don't.
Like, what kind of role would they have played in the invasion of Japan?
Yeah, I don't know. Good question. I'm glad we didn't have to find out.
I mean, I'd say pretty extensive in the sense of intel gathering and dealing with tides and all that. Now, one of the dimensions you have in the Pacific is all this coral that's off the coast of some of the places you're invading. They have to use explosives to get through that. By later in 1945, these are highly developed, highly trained teams that are probably going to have a leading role. Quite different than you're going to see in the European theater, what we have like at Omaha Beach, but still the mission is something of the same kind of thing.
Yeah, see, you asked the wrong guy.
There you go.
Yeah. I was just going to point out from the Japanese perspective that the Japanese ground tactics have morphed yet again in anticipation of the invasion. That whereas they had moved in Peleliu and Okinawa, I think is the most prevalent example of they just completely ceded the landing beaches to the Americans and said, we're dug in on the Shuri line, come at me. That has changed in the planning for Kyushu, that now there are going to be more Japanese units that are going to be more forward positioned. The goal is not necessarily to deny the Americans the beaches or to try to kick them back into the ocean. They know that they can't do that, but there were certainly plans to counterattack the Americans very vigorously at the waterline. I personally don't think that by this time in the war, everybody understood that the Americans can land anywhere they want to, and there's nothing you can do to keep them off that beach. The question then becomes, how do you extract the maximum casualties after they have?
I mean, the Japanese mindset from the beginning was that Americans are hamburger-eating, movie-going, lazy people, and that at some point, you will realize that fighting a war thousands of miles away from your homeland at great expense, not only in treasure but in blood, is simply not worth it. You'll come to your senses and we'll reach some kind of negotiation. So the idea is make the Americans pay extensively. Americans are going to take Iwo Jima. They're going to take Peleliu. They're going to take these places, but they're going to pay for it through the teeth. And at some point, you'll figure it out and stop it.
Well, I'm just going to say one thing. I like hamburgers.
Stand up for hamburgers.
And I like movies. But to add to what Craig was saying, too, is it's really about, this is all about how the war is going to end. It's about bloodletting the Americans so that they have a better position at the bargaining table to undo unconditional surrender and essentially to preserve the monarchy and the of Thrones. I mean, it's all an end game, really, to protect one dude's job at the end of the day. Right.
That's true.
Gentlemen, all the way to your right, towards the back, please.
Great discussion. Question about comments that you had earlier about the U.S. Navy and the Air
Can you
Force
speak
were
up a little
running.
bit? I'm
Sorry,
sorry.
the U.S. Navy and the Air Force were running out of targets by this time in the war. Did the Japanese have any plans to bring troops from China to augment their troops on the home islands?
We covered that a little bit. At this point, given the mining campaign that's basically closed off all of Japan's harbors at this point, they were able to bring limited numbers of troops over from China and Korea, but there's no ability to bring in, wholesale divisions or that kind of thing. They really have been reduced to the same modes of transportation that you see in campaigns like the Solomons, where you're trying to run barges over and that kind of stuff. There weren't any ships that were going to be bringing over, a regiment at a time or something like that. So realistically speaking, the Japanese forces that were in China were basically marooned there by the time you get to April, May of 1945. Is that?
Yeah, when they tried, for example, to bring a division over to Japan, or actually in this particular case, I think it was into Luzon, Ultra, the American ability to read Japanese codes, was sent out to what we called combined action groups, wolf packs essentially of submarines, just closed in on that and sank the entire thing. Rich Frank has done some work on this and demonstrated that American submarines killed more Japanese soldiers than the United States Marine Corps in World War II. And this is one of the ways they did it. The Japanese had so many men committed to the continent of Asia, they could not get them to where the fighting front was, and that's because not only had the submarines cut off all supply, but we also had this intelligence coup that allowed us to figure out when they were going to try to do it.
And from an Imperial Japanese Army perspective, in a way, the war is on the Asian continent. It's in China. That's where the bulk of the soldiers had generally been deployed, and many were marooned there. So there's a lot of scenarios that we're mulling over toward the end of the war that seem kind of bizarre now, but there's concern about it at the time. We're actually concerned that we could actually, seize and conquer the home islands, and you would have this rump Japanese state continuing on the Asian continent with the Kwantung Army in Manchuria and elsewhere. So there's some lip service paid to the possibility of having an amphibious invasion to invade the Chinese coast with United States Army divisions as one possibility, but a more tangible possibility that's sort of in the works when the war comes to an end is Lieutenant General Al Wiedemeyer, who is basically now working with Chiang Kai-shek. He succeeds Joe Stilwell in China, is masterminding basically a plan which you'll husband much of the nationalist Chinese army to have a major offensive in China to recapture a lot of the ports that the Chinese had lost earlier in the war. And so that's all in the offing too. So we tend to fixate on, well, what's going to happen with Operation Olympic and all that, and rightfully so, I guess. But there's this other element too that is in play as well. So as we've discussed many times, how's this war going to end? It's just a series of bad options you have to choose from, and whatever is going to be the least bad option is what we hope will happen.
Gentlemen, next question's all the way to your left with Connie, please.
With the spring bombing of civilians in Japan, was there any pushback at all at the War Department or within the body politic in D.C., or no, everybody was completely on board?
No, that's a really good question, and there was a lot of concern that there might be. In fact, so the Army Air Force back in the Pentagon. In fact, LeMay doesn't tell anybody he's about to do this. So Hap Arnold's had a major heart attack in early 45, and so he's recovering down in Miami. And in his place is Hap Arnold's chief of staff, a guy by the name of Larry Norstad. And LeMay does not like Norstad because he thinks that Norstad is effectively gunning for his job potentially. But he is his conduit back to Washington. And so LeMay actually, when he starts thinking about doing this firebombing, he sends a message in February back to Norstad, and he says, look, I'm cooking up some ideas here, but I think you need to come out here and let me tell you about them in person. Of course, at this point, it's a really long trip out there. You're flying by propeller plane.
Still a really long trip.
Still a really long. We can attest to that. It's still a very long trip out there. And so North side's like, yeah, I'll get there when I get there. And finally, as February rolls into March, LeMay sends him another cryptic message. He's like, you need to get out here. And so Norstad gets on a plane on March 7th, and he arrives on March 9th, which at this point, they're fueling up the bombers. And he pulls him in, he says, oh, by the way, everything we've been doing for the last 3 years, it's all going to change tonight. And that's the first indication outside of theater of what LeMay's planning. And so what is Norstad's response? Well, he sends this message back to Washington. He says, things are about to change. Get publicity ready for this. And so any fear of pushback is really, at that point, pretty much disappears. But there was still very much great concern. If you look in the records, too, the Army Air Forces, they're monitoring what's going on in the editorial pages, things that are being said in the congressional record, and radio broadcasts, for any sense that killing civilians is going to create this sort of blowback. And I think the Time magazine has this headline, it has this article after the March 9th, 10th raid, in which it says, if properly kindled, Japanese cities will burn like the autumn leaves. And I think that kind of typified the American media's response to this. And at that point, it's a green light. And LeMay just starts burning cities after that. And so you really don't see any of that kind of pushback much in the media at all at that point. And I think that kind of paves the way in many ways for the atomic bomb, because had there been tremendous pushback on that, had there been uproar and lawmakers going onto the floor of the Senate or the House decrying this kind of stuff, it may have caused different views in Washington. Because you have to remember, the atomic bomb is a separate beast. Okay, it is being ultimately, yes, it's going to be flown out of Tinian and dropped, but it's being controlled out of Washington. It's being run essentially by Henry Stimson and by Leslie Groves, and they purposely keep control of this new weapon in Washington rather than turning it over to the theater commander. And so I think that firebombing and sort of the lack of that pushback really not only paves the way for LeMay's continued campaign, but also for the atomic bombs that John Curatola is going to talk about.
So we have time for at least one question, hopefully two. So we're going to go in the back to the center, please.
Thank you, gentlemen. My father was a squad leader in the 7th Infantry Division, Luzon and Okinawa, and I was wondering if you could speak to what he would have, for the 7th Infantry Division, what would their role have been in downfall and Coronet?
Yeah, I mean, the 7th Infantry Division was going to be intimately involved in the invasion of Japan, because it's one of the lead units in the entire United States Army forces in the Pacific. They had fought, I think, 3 campaigns by then. So really, if it's like most infantry divisions, it's almost a brand new group of guys that's going to be in play versus what you might have had it out to earlier in the war, or Kwajalein, whatever. So the role is basically just an assault role, in terms of getting ashore and fighting and gaining ground. I mean, it's really no more ambiguous than that. So basically what your father and others, I think, would have faced is more of the same but worse. If we're talking in generalities, that's what's in front of them. So the Hourglass Division, which still exists, by the way, is a key element of everything that's going to happen going forward in terms of the ground forces. Whether they're going to be assigned to Kruger's 6th Army, Eichelberger's 8th Army in the different roles, I mean, that's still a bit in flux as we get, towards the end of the Battle of Okinawa. But I don't know that it matters. It's going to be horrible either way.
We're going to go in the back center aisle with Connie, please.
My father-in-law was assigned or stepped up to a position, I believe, with the ASA. Do you know anything about the A? I'm sure you do. What is ASA? What do they do? He was in that post-war.
ASA? Did you? Oh, okay.
Thank you, Rich Frank.
Okay.
Thank you, Rich. Yeah. Gold star.
Thinking, what?
Yeah.
The Army Security Agency, is that what Rich said?
You have stumped the panel. Very well done. Next question, please.
He's not allowed to come back.
Yeah. Let's remove him.
Security.
On that note, high point, low point, let's give a round of applause for John, James, and Craig. Thank you all. Now we will venture outside. I ask you to join the panelists for their book signing out at the retail station. And you can also join them, as John and James so ably plugged. You can join them overseas on many of our tours. Visit the info desk during the break, too. Go with John Parshall on our Pacific tour, going to Saipan, Tinian, Guam, and also our Pearl Harbor 85th anniversary tour. James for our Philippines tour, as well as our Pacific tour, and post tour for our Pearl Harbor 85, I think, in Japan. John McManus for our Seine River cruises that we offer, and Craig, who used to go with us, and we're going to try our darndest to get Mary Lou to allow us to take you back on any of these trips. So enjoy your lunch. Please be back here for 1:30 sharp. And one last round of applause for John Parshall, James Scott, John McManus, and Craig Symonds.